This talk began while I was reading Stephen Hines' new biography of Dogen, which is Dogen, Japan's first Zen teacher. And I'd started reading it to get some clarity on three subjects that have been stirring around in my head for quite a while. First, I wanted to understand more about how Dogen wrote each of his major works, the Shobogenzo, the extensive record, his koan collection, and so on. Second, I wanted to see how Tendai doctrines, the school of Buddhism that Dogen belonged to originally, how it had influenced him, and specifically the doctrine of Hongaku, the doctrine of original enlightenment. And third, I wanted to understand more clearly how the course of Dogen's life affected his teachings. So this will also pick up on a thread from one of my earlier Dharma talks from quite a while ago, where I alluded to the question that Dogen was trying to answer with all of his Buddhist practice, the reason why he'd made his journey to China and back. So now I'll be able to answer that. So in order to understand Dogen's place in the history of Buddhism, we need to step back almost 700 years from his day to the mid-6th century of the Common Era, the time when Buddhism first entered Japan from Korea. For them it was a momentous occasion, but the royal court was concerned about letting a foreign religion like Buddhism into the country. However, they did like the idea of the spiritual power that Buddhism offered them, so they allowed one clan, the Soga, to practice Buddhism for the good of the country. It must have gone pretty well because about 100 years later, the imperial family itself began to practice this new religion. And this was the beginning of a monopoly that the imperial family had on control of Buddhism in the country, to the point where the main activities of the monks were various rites and rituals to create merit for the royal family and the nation. So if we fast forward another 100 years from there, we see the introduction into Japan, but mainly into the capital of what became known as the 6 Nara schools. They were the Vinaya, Tattva Siddhi, Abhidharmakosha, Madhyamaka, Yogacara, and Huayan. And some of these, Yogacara and the Huayan specifically, you might recognize since they were later absorbed into Zen and disappeared as independent schools. All 6 of these were under royal control, of course. However, at this time, there were apparently monks and priests who existed outside of the system, and they tended to be critical of the system and thus were subject to punishment since they weren't officially sanctioned. But they continued on. Then in about 805, 250 years after Buddhism was introduced to Japan, a Japanese monk named Saicho returned from China, where he'd been studying the Tiantai school of Buddhism, known in Japan as Tendai. A year later, the Tendai school of esoteric Buddhism gained official recognition from the emperor, and a complex was established for it on Mount Hiei, which was considered a powerfully sacred mountain even before the Buddhists arrived. It was the home of Sano, a kami or a god that was later said to be a Gongen, which is an emanation of Shakyamuni Buddha. So fast forward another 400 years from there, this is between the time of Tendai's establishment on Mount Hiei and Dogen's day. Tendai had achieved a near complete monopoly on court support and prestige. But just prior to Dogen's birth, signs that this monopoly's breakup began to appear. A new wave of holy men and preachers began roaming the countryside. The chanting of the Nimbutsu became popular with the general population, and the veneration of the Lotus Sutra really began in earnest. All of these moved religious practice out from the state's control and into the hands of the common person. And it was in this prior generation that a monk who would become very important to Dogen's life made his trip to China. This was the monk Eisai. He was born in 1141, so about 2 generations before Dogen. He began his career as a Tendai monk, and he never really fully gave it up. It would have been difficult at that time since any other sects other than Tendai were illegal. Much like Dogen, over the course of his life, he began to become disillusioned with the state of Japanese Buddhism He also saw too many monks treating religion as a career and not caring about the actual teachings. So in hopes of finding that renewal in China, Eisai made a short trip overseas when he was 28 years old. And he came back with a bunch of Tendai texts and dedicated the next 2 decades of his life to reforming Tendai. After all of this, he still wasn't completely satisfied, so at the age of 46, he returned to China for a longer stay, this time of 4 years. He returned from this trip a Rinzai Zen master and continued trying to reform Japanese Buddhism, now with a focus of creating an eclectic blend of Tendai and Rinzai Zen. And as an aside, right in the middle of Eisai's second trip to China, the 400 years of peace under the Fujiwara clan came to an end. The empire gave way to the shogunate, and this ushered in many centuries of samurai warfare and rule. And in all of this, Eisai saw an opportunity and found a willing audience for Zen doctrine in the shogun himself. Through relationships in the capital, Eisai was able to find a legal place in the new social order for his blend of Tendai and Zen doctrines. So with that background in place, we can move on to the main topic, which is Dogen's life. Dogen's early life was influenced by the powerful ties that his family had with the ruling class. Through birth, he had ties to the 3 most prestigious clans in Japan. His father, who was a general and chancellor, came from the Minamoto clan, and through this line he could claim descent from Murakami, who was an emperor in the mid-900s of the Common Era. This also meant that Dogen was a distant relative of the then current emperor. Through his mother, he was directly related to the Fujiwara clan that we just talked about, whose downfall after 400 years of relative peace would usher in a much more warlike era. However, even though the Fujiwara were in decline, they were still very powerful in the capital, and this relationship would prove both useful and detrimental to Dogen over the years. In this talk, I'll be focusing mainly on the first half of Dogen's life, however, the period covering just about 26 years. Now, there's not a lot of information about Dogen's younger years, at least in English, and for a while I was beginning to think that he was just a lonely only child, so I never heard anything about family. But then I discovered that he'd had 11 brothers and 3 sisters, some of them much older and were already established in the royal court, and at least 2 of them were highly placed monastics. In 1202, when Dogen was 3, his father passed away. After this, either an uncle or a much older half-brother adopted him. And Dogen almost never referred to his late father in his writings. He instead referred to his uncle or his half-brother as his father. This is the first of many losses in Dogen's life that helped chart his path through the Dharma. Soon afterwards, his foster father began to oversee his training as a member of the royal court. As well, his mother provided him with a traditional upper-class education in Confucian and Taoist classics. And it seemed that Dogen was a bit of a prodigy, which doesn't seem too far-fetched, judging by the quality and depth of his writings later in life. It was 5 years later, however, in 1207, when the greatest shock came to the young Dogen. This was the year that his mother passed away. His mother's death had a profound effect on him. It was during a conversation with her on her deathbed that she pressed young Dogen to join the monkhood once he was mature enough to make the conversion. And this put him on a collision course with the rest of his family, who were all eager to see him take up a prestigious post in the bureaucracy. But Dogen's mind was made up. And even further, it was at his mother's funeral when Dogen watched the smoke rising up from a stick of incense, catching the first glimpse of a spiritual problem that would define the first half of his life. And that problem is impermanence. Impermanence overall defined this part of his life in deeply specific ways. There was the decline of the Fujiwara clan after the 400 years of rule. There was the loss of his birth father when he's almost too young to remember. And there was the loss of his mother that crystallized all this impermanence together with his aspirations towards the Buddhist path. This path, he saw, wouldn't only honor his mother, but it would also offer a chance of transcending the impermanence and suffering of this world. However, with all this loss and impermanence, it can be said Dogen's family, they didn't abandon him. It was quite the opposite. Relatives on both sides came forward offering to adopt him and help him towards a fruitful career. He was ultimately taken in by a granduncle who had no heir, and he continued his study of classical Chinese and Japanese texts. And it was said by the age of 8 years old, Dogen was already able to read the dense Indian Buddhist text, the Abhidharma Kosha of Vasubandhu, in a Chinese edition. I don't know if you've ever seen the Abhidharma Kosha, but it's very large and very encompassing commentary on the Abhidharma, which is the final layer of the Pali Canon, where an attempt was made to systematize all the various teachings of the Buddha. And this would have been a tremendous study tool for the young Dogen, since it laid out the previous 1,700 years of Buddhist learning in one giant volume. And as I hinted before, there's not a lot of information about this time in Dogen's life, but his granduncle certainly wanted to make sure his ward was set up well career-wise. But seeing how obstinate Dogen could be later in life, nothing was going to keep him from the path that his mother had set him on. So in 1212, when Dogen was 12 years old, his family began preparing him for his coming-of-age celebration, which was going to be his inauguration into life as a court official. However, instead of attending the celebration, Dogen ran away to Mount Hiei, the mountain where the main temple of the Tendai school was located. I don't know where Dogen was living when he ran away, but I can't imagine it was just a short trip across town. It most likely would have been a major undertaking that could have proven to his family the seriousness of his intention on becoming a monk. And all this isn't to say that Dogen was completely on his own, since the monk that he ran away to, who was living in a little temple at the foot of Mount Hiei, was a maternal uncle, Ryokan. At first he turned the boy away, knowing that the monastic life was against his family's wishes, but Dogen continued to press his uncle, telling the older man that he was fulfilling a wish of his mother. So finally his uncle relented and set him off up to the main temple on Mount Hiei, which was one of the most prestigious centers of Buddhist learning in Japan at the time. So he's at Mount Hiei, and a year later, the novice Dogen took the tonsure, meaning he officially became a monk at Mount Hiei and received the dharma name Dogen, meaning original way. His birth name has been lost, and only his dharma name remains. So I didn't find anything that elaborated on why this particular name was given to Dogen, but if he manifested for his teacher that same fiery spirit and the single-minded devotion to the ancestral path that we see in his later works, then Original Way seems like an awfully appropriate name for the young monk. It's at this time that we'll take a brief detour into the teachings of Tendai, a school that would greatly influence Dogen's later thought. And one thing that's become pretty apparent to me over the course of this study is how much Dogen took from what came before him and reinterpreted it through his own experience of enlightenment and his practice of Zazen. And it would be difficult to overemphasize the importance of Dogen's time as a Tendai monk on his practice. I'd originally supposed I'd be focusing mainly on Tendai's doctrine of original enlightenment, which Dogen butted heads against for over a decade. But a lot of surprising parallels to Dogen's later doctrines can be found in the teachings of the Tendai school. So allow me to give a brief synopsis of Tendai doctrine and practice. The main teaching that binds it all together is the Lotus Sutra. Of all the various practices that the Tendai monks did, copying, memorizing, and studying the Lotus Sutra was the most important. Their name itself was the Tendai Lotus School, so that reflects that importance. Another important doctrine was the fourfold practice, which consisted of Zen, which is just meditation, Jodo, Pure Land practices, Kai, precepts, and Mikyo, esoteric practices. For Tendai, Zen tended to take on forms from the Pali Suttas, so following the breath was very common. There was also a meditation that they called Shikan, which isn't related to Shikantaza despite the odd surface level similarity. Shi is calming and Kan is seeing, so this is just shamatha and vipassana, calming and insight meditation, one of the original styles of meditation advocated by the Buddha. The second element of the fourfold practice was Pure Land practices, and this mainly involved chanting the Nembutsu, which is just chanting Namu Amida Butsu over and over again, which means I take refuge in the Buddha Amitabha, who is the Buddha of the Pure Land. Through chanting the Nembutsu, the practitioner could gain spiritual power from Amitabha and ultimately be reborn in his Pure Land, where it would be much easier to achieve enlightenment versus in our world. The third element was the Bodhisattva precepts, which stand in distinction here from the Pali Canon precepts. The Bodhisattva precepts were handed down from teacher to student, so they bypassed what the Tendai establishment saw as an overbearing bureaucracy. It was run by corrupt monks who were agents of the state, and what was worse, were more interested in climbing the monastic ladder than in Buddhism proper. Finally, there was Mikyo, the esoteric practices, which you'll often hear them being called secret practices, but they're only secret in the sense that they were passed down from teacher to student and not openly in manuals, although they were sometimes also passed down in manuals. Esoteric Buddhism stands out from its peers in that it was influenced by later trends in Indian Buddhism, namely the Tantras. The main element of esoteric Buddhism are the 3 M's, mantras, mudras, and mandalas. This is a further development of the idea of the threefold practice that you'll find in the Pali Canon, meaning practice through body, which is mudra, speech, mantra, and mind, mandala. Typically, the practitioner would be seated with their hands folded into a particular mudra, like the cosmic mudra of Zazen, while simultaneously chanting a mantra and visualizing any number of things, typically deities, the Sanskrit characters of the mantra, or both. The final Tendai doctrine that we'll talk about is probably the most important for this talk, for Dogen and for Soto Zen in general, and that's Hongaku, the doctrine of original enlightenment. Dogen came to Mount Hiei with the quest, not too different from the Buddha or any one of us, but where the Buddha was trying to find an ending to suffering, Dogen was looking for a way to understand impermanence. In the face of the fleetingness of mortal life, what constituted a purpose or a meaning? He could have looked to enlightenment as a solution for his troubles, but being in the Tendai order, the party line was that young Dogen was already enlightened. And this is an issue that continues to rear its head in Zen today. It goes all the way back, at least to the Tang Dynasty, the 8th or 9th century in China, and to Huineng in particular, the 6th patriarch, with his teaching of sudden enlightenment. Dogen's issue, however, if he was already enlightened, then why did he need to practice the Buddha Dharma at all? And it might be tempting to think that Dogen's teachers just didn't understand his questions or his issues, but Tendai also preaches that practice manifests enlightenment, which leads me to think that Dogen was just doing what most of us do in the beginning, trying to think his way into enlightenment. With all the various mudras and mantras and styles of meditation, none of them were able to point Dogen right at the living present moment. And he was beginning to realize that even the most prestigious Buddhist institution in the country wouldn't be a place that he'd be able to discover it. He gave it a solid try, though. He spent 2 years at Mount Hiei before, in 1214, he left temporarily to visit Onjoji, which was a smaller, related Tendai temple that was considered a rival to Mount Hiei. So this was another bold move on the young Dogen's part. Once he arrived at the new temple, though, he discovered that the abbot was, yet again, a maternal uncle. The older man spent some time listening to his nephew's questions and confusions, and he understood that Dogen wouldn't find any new answers at this temple either, so he suggested that Dogen visit Kenninji. And what is Kenninji? It's the temple that was established by Eisai, where he tested out his mix of Rinzai and Tendai teachings. And I would like to tell you some interesting stories about these two larger-than-life figures, Dogen and Eisai, battling it out in the Dharma Hall, but unfortunately these years of Dogen's life, 1215 to 1222 specifically, are pretty murky. We don't even know if they met in person. Dogen arrived at some point during the year that Eisai passed away. There is a story that's been passed down about Dogen receiving a koan lesson from Eisai about Buddha nature and original enlightenment, but no one knows if it actually happened or not. So Dogen remained at this monastery for 2 years before he officially became a student of Eisai's successor, Myozen, in 1217. Under Myozen, Dogen studied Vinaya, so monastic rules, Shamatha Vipassana, calming and insight meditation, and koans, of which he became very proficient. Like elsewhere, Dogen shone very brightly as a student, and in a short time he became Myozen's official dharma heir. And it's strange to note that given this frequent sniping between Rinzai and Soto schools over the centuries, that Dogen is also a Rinzai lineage holder in addition to a Soto lineage, which we'll hear more about in just a bit. So in all, Dogen spent 7 or 8 years practicing and studying at Kenninji, working further with the Tendai teachings and mastering the Rinzai teachings. However, even with all this practice under his belt, Dogen still hadn't settled his great doubt. And so it was sometime around 1222 that Dogen decided, along with his teacher Myozen, to make the perilous sea voyage to China in order to study Zen straight from the source. Prior to this time, it wouldn't only have been physically dangerous to make the sea crossing, but it also would have been politically impossible. It was only in these later years that the Hojo clan claimed success in the battle for political dominance in Japan, that suddenly a new peace arose for the first time in decades, which allowed travel to the mainland. And this finally brings us to Dogen's 4 tremendous years in Japan, along with his teacher Myozen and a few other unnamed monks. He was in China from the spring of 1223 to the summer of 1227. And as I said before, it wasn't a light undertaking. Due to storms and piracy, it was estimated about half of the people who left for China didn't return. So it was seriously a matter of life and death, and it's a testament to Dogen's seriousness of the pursuit of the way that he was willing to take this gamble. There was really nothing that would stop him. However, when he finally did get to China, he faced a setback. He was stuck on the ship for either administrative or health reasons. There are conflicting reports. Myozen went off ahead to Tian Tong Monastery and began the summer retreat there. At the time, was headed by a Rinzai-affiliated abbot. And there's no record of what happened to the other monks, or where they went, or what they did. Importantly, though, it was while stuck on the ship that Dogen met a monastery cook who made quite an impression on him. The story goes that this old monk came on board looking to buy Japanese mushrooms. Over tea, Dogen discovered that he was the cook from the monastery where Myozen was studying. Dogen asked about the distance the monk had traveled to get to the ships. 10.5 miles, the old monk said. Continuing with Dogen's retelling of the encounter from his Tenzo Kyokun, or instructions to the cook, he writes, I asked, when will you return to the monastery? He said, if I can buy the mushrooms now, I'll set off right after that. I said, today I didn't expect to meet you and have a conversation on this ship. It's most fortunate, is it not, for this karmic bond? I will treat you, the Zen master, to a meal. The cook said, that's impossible. If I don't oversee the preparations for tomorrow's meal offering, it won't turn out well. I said, aren't there co-workers in the monastery who understand the meals? What'll be deficient if only one officer, the cook, isn't present? The cook said, I took up this position in my later years. It's this old man's pursuit of the way. How could I hand it over to others? Besides, when I came, I didn't ask to stay away overnight. Again, I asked the cook, you are venerable in years. Why don't you sit in meditation and pursue the way or contemplate the words of the ancients? It's troublesome being a cook. All you do is work. What good is that? The cook laughed and said, my good man from a foreign country, you do not yet understand the pursuit of the way. We can suss out from this encounter some interesting things about Dogen's conception of the way at this time. He still seems to think that it's something quite different from this everyday life and moment. Dogen also still seems to harbor royal pretensions and that other people should be doing the grunt work of the monastery while the monks remain in the refined meditation poses doing the diligent work of pursuing the way. It was sometime after this encounter that once Dogen was able to leave this ship, he was allowed to wander and visit the Gozan, which is the 5 mountain monasteries. It was a privilege that was hardly ever offered to foreign monks, and especially to a monk as young as Dogen. And as a side note, it was during this time that he first saw monks placing their cases on their heads, which is a ritual he found both charming and deeply moving, and of course it's a ritual that we still follow to this day as we chant the robe verse. Still, however privileged Dogen might have been to have so much freedom of movement and access, he became disillusioned with the teachers he met in China. None of them were up to snuff by his estimation. meaning that none of them were able to answer the question of impermanence and original enlightenment that he'd been carrying around for so long, and that was the focal point of his practice. It was during this time that Dogen apparently had a vision of an arhat telling him to return to Tiantong Monastery, where a new abbot had just arrived. He also heard somewhere along the line news that Myozen, his current teacher, had fallen sick. And all of this, his time in China, his time spent in the Tendai and Rinzai monasteries, his long mournful history with his parents, all of it was leading up to this momentous year for Dogen of 1225. And what happened? First of all, Myozen passed away. Second, this was the year that Dogen met Rujing, the man who would become his greatest teacher. By the time the brash 25-year-old Dogen finally laid eyes on this old Chinese monk, Dogen had cultivated quite an attitude of superiority, having been unable to find anyone who could answer his questions. And yet, on their first meeting, Rujing squashed Dogen's ego flat. What Rujing said to him isn't recorded. These types of things were kept private. But both men had significantly impressed one another. Dogen had found the teacher he'd been looking for, and Rujing had finally found the dharma heir that he'd been looking for. The bond between them was immediately strong. Dogen requested in writing to be allowed to visit Rujing's chambers day or night in order to ask about the dharma, as he put it, without regard to formal or informal behavior, which is a fancy way of saying like a father-son relationship. And Rujing agreed. And these conversations were so important for Dogen that he kept a record of them in Chinese that he called the private conversations. There were 50 in all, and they covered everything from meditation instructions of various types, all the way to various types of Buddhist monasteries that could be found in China. And one thing that it does reveal is that both men understood the importance of Dogen's bringing the Dharma to Japan, which they viewed not unlike Bodhidharma's transmission of Zen to China. And so it was that under Rujing's eye that Dogen first practiced Zazen, and he did so assiduously, hardly resting, determined to break through. Rujing, as Dogen claims, was the only teacher he found in China who advocated what would later be Soto-style seated meditation, or shikantaza, just sitting. Rujing was as devoted to the practice then as Dogen would become later himself, and something about the simplicity of the practice just gripped Dogen. Compared to the overabundance of cultivation and meditation techniques that he'd practiced in the past, all the mudras and mantras and visualizations, the absolute simplicity and the lack of purpose in Zazen, it struck the young Dogen powerfully. And it was in this context that the third momentous event occurred. During the summer of 1225, while up late one night meditating, Rujing scolded a monk who had fallen asleep seated beside Dogen. "Studying Zen is a matter of casting off body-mind. Why are you engaged in single-minded slumber rather than single-minded meditative sitting?" Hearing this, Dogen cast off body-mind, Shinjin Datsuraku, and in a flash, the issues and stress that he'd been carrying with himself just melted away. Later that night, he had his realization confirmed by Rujing in the master's chambers. And before I elaborate on what this experience meant for Dogen, allow me just to give a summary of his remaining time in China, which lasted just 2 more years. And honestly, we don't know too much about what he did during this time. We know that he composed poems as part of his duties at the monastery for lay practitioners, and finally, in 1227, Rujing felt that Dogen was the equal of his Buddhist ancestors, and so he sent him back to Japan as a full-fledged Zen master. So this talk ultimately began as an exploration of how Dogen's enlightenment experience intersected with his question about impermanence and original enlightenment. His impetus was to understand impermanence. Everything that appears must also fade away. Why? To the untrained mind, this seems completely unfair, and it's the cause of much suffering. It's our attachment to temporary things, which is just about everything, that causes us such great stress and dissatisfaction. So what are we supposed to do with that? It was in Dogen's enlightenment experience that he saw how our original enlightenment means that we're always truly enlightened, but it's through the act of Zazen and through the practice of the precepts that we manifest that enlightenment, that we cause it to be realized. Dogen looked closely and saw no difference between practice and realization. This means that enlightenment isn't a state that we enter or that we put on or that we inhabit, but it's an active process that we cultivate. It's a process that is us. For Dogen, it's not a matter of cutting through delusion to release the enlightenment that's hiding there, but the enlightenment itself is working with one's delusion to see it for what it is. But there's also another way to look at all this. The thing that allows us to become enlightened, the soil from which our Buddhahood actually springs, is our Buddha nature. And there have been various explanations about what the Buddha nature is over the centuries, and Dogen felt some of them veered a little too closely to an Atman, a soul or an underlying substance with an inherent being. He looked at this situation and had his great insight that relieved all of his long unanswered suffering. And that insight was that Buddha nature is none other than impermanence itself, the same impermanence that he'd been contending with all those years since his mother's passing. This idea is truly the complement of practice enlightenment, meaning that enlightenment only exists as a process that we undertake. This very undertaking actualizes our inherent freedom, but that leaves the question of what is our inherent enlightenment? How does it come about? It comes about through Buddha nature, which is impermanence, which is not a thing, not a noun, but an active characteristic of all being. It's like Dogen talks about in Uji, being time. All being is time, and all time is being. This means that what we are as beings isn't static, but that it's an active, ever-developing process, constantly in a state of flux, of growth, of freedom. This very impermanence that seems so harsh to the young Dogen, something to be escaped, turned out to be the exact thing that allowed us to be free of our suffering and enact our inherent Buddhahood. And there's nothing permanent about us. We flow freely with the entire universe. We perceive ourselves arising through the illusory dharmas that we use to manufacture our conception of the world, cutting up reality into an array of objects that we can put names on and purposes to. But we're also indistinguishable from that illusory flow, from that array of dharmas, of ideas and purposes. Through impermanence, we're able to eat, breathe, flourish, live, and ultimately die. But through impermanence, we also see that we neither arise or fall. Since there's no beginning or end to what it is that we are. Impermanence points us right towards this present moment, Nikon, that we inhabit as Genjo Koan, the actualization of the fundamental point of existence where duality and non-duality are bridged and the totality of experience is summed up in the needle point of Zazen. The mind is a universe, distinct and yet boundless and undefined as itself. This is ultimately how Dogen would come to see the world and the Dharma, but this conception didn't just spring fully formed from his mind immediately after this experience on the cushion. In embryo, yes, but it took him a while to digest the experience and begin to work it into a cohesive system that could be taught to other people. That work would take up the entire second half of his life, another good 26 years of teaching and writing and laying the groundwork for an institution and a lifestyle and a practice that's still with us today. But that story will have to wait till next time. So for now, I'll take my leave and wish you well. Thank you. Okay, so I'm here a few days after the talk because I just found some information that corrects and adds to some of the stuff that I've been talking about. The first bit is the quickest one. I'd said that the monk that Dogen met while on ship had come from Tiantog Monastery. That wasn't right. He'd actually come from Ayuwang Monastery, so that one's not a biggie. However, I also found a translation of Dogen's private conversations, the Hokkyo Ki. I'd said earlier that Dogen had written down his questions and Rujing's answers, but that wasn't quite right. It was pretty common practice when Japanese students would work with Chinese masters to conduct their dokusan, their student-teacher conversations, completely in writing. That kind of helped lessen the language barrier between the Chinese and Japanese speakers. Although Dogen wrote elsewhere that by the end of his stay in China, he was able to converse pretty well in Chinese. The work itself starts off immediately interesting. The very first section of the actual text is Dogen's request to Rujing for unrestricted access to him in order to discuss the Dharma. As part of this request, Dogen laid out his previous practice history, like we still tend to do when we're introducing ourselves to a new teacher or sangha. Through the record of this request, a few of my assumptions about the state of Dogen's practice while in Japan were confirmed. So the text. The mind that aspires to enlightenment arose in me at an early age. This is a reference to his mother's passing. In my search for the way, I visited various religious teachers in my own land and gained some understanding of the causal nature of the world. This sounds like karma or interdependent origination to me. Yet the real end of the three treasures, Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha, was still unclear to me. I clung vainly to the banner of mere names and forms, meaning that he was trying to think his way onto the path. Later I entered the chambers of the Zen master Eisai and there first learned the characteristic ways of the Renzai school. This is referring to his time at Kenninji in his studies under Myozen. Now I have accompanied priest Myozen to the land of Sung, China. I have sailed 10,000 leagues entrusting this phantom body of mine to the surging seas. I have at last reached the great Sung, and am able to join your students and receive your guidance and Dharma teaching. It must be the blessing of some favorable karma from a previous existence. He continues on, eventually asking directly for admittance to the master's chambers, as I said previously, without regard to formal or informal dress, like a father-son relationship. There is, however, an even more informative passage from the Zui Monki, the record of things heard, that Dogen spoke concerning his studies before heading off to China. He said, "It was the realization of the transiency of this world that first stirred my mind towards seeking the way," meaning impermanence. I went to many temples, visited numerous masters. Finally, I left Mount Hiei, and my study of the way took me to Kenninji. Until then, I had never met a real teacher or a good friend, meaning a good spiritual friend, someone to accompany you along the way. I was deluded and filled with erroneous thoughts. What follows pretty much confirms what I'd suspected about Dogen's early learning and training, but it also shows that it really was his teachers that were holding him back from answering his great spiritual question. So he continues, "The teachers I had seen had advised me first to study until I could be as learned as those who had preceded me. I was told to make myself known to the state and to gain fame in the world. Therefore, even while studying the teachings, what was uppermost in my mind was to become the equal of the ancient wise men of Japan, or of those who had gained the title of great teacher. That's Daosho, a Buddhist ancestor, the men and women on our lineage charts. But on opening the lives of eminent monks in its sequel, which was a pretty popular book about ancient monks and their biographies at the time, and on learning about the great priests and Buddhists of China, I could see that their approach differed from those of my teachers. I sensed that the aims with which I had been inspired were looked down upon and despised in all the scriptures and biographical works. By even thinking about fame, I would be disgracing the old men of wisdom and the men of goodwill to come, while earning a fine name among inferior persons of this period. If I wanted to emulate someone, it should be the former sages and eminent priests of China and India rather than those of Japan. Feeling shame for the fact that I was not equal to them, I realized that, indeed, I should try to be like the unseen gods of the many heavens and like the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. After coming to this understanding, I regarded the great teachers of this country as so much dirt and broken tile. My physical and mental makeup changed completely." Then he continues on, foreshadowing his future relationship with his own high station in life, and even aspects of his future living situation. When we look at the actions of the Buddha in his lifetime, we find that he went into the mountains and forests, renouncing his noble rank. Even after his enlightenment, he spent the rest of his life begging for food. The Vinaya says, knowing his home was not the true one, he cast it aside and became a monk. All of this information, straight from Dogen himself, really helps to show why he felt it was necessary to brave the waters of the sea and take the dangerous journey to the mainland. He really felt that there was no other option available to him if he was going to answer his pressing question of impermanence. And fortunately for him and for us, he did. And as I said, I'll talk more about how that unfolded in the second half of his life in an upcoming talk. So, thank you.
I'm going to close the sutra, then we'll open it up for questions.
May this merit extend universally to all, so that we together with all beings may realize the Buddha way.
question, Shinkyu.
Yeah.
Are Dogen's private conversations with this teacher available anywhere?
There's one translation into English that's been out of print for, I think it was in the 80s, so about 40 years. It is available, but it's very expensive.
Those are private. You should be reading them.
Yeah. It's crazy when I found out about it. I'm like, why is that not widely available? It's not widely available, but it is available. One of these days, I think you can get a PDF of it for relatively cheap, like $30 or $40 or something like that. I'm gonna get a copy of it one of these days and take a look at it. Hein talks about some of it in his Dogen biography, but not all of it. Yeah.
I had a question, and I don't know if this is something you or Suji could answer. I know that you mentioned, several teachers that Dogen took during their lifetime. And when we chant our lineage, I went to go double check, and the person that precedes Dogen is Tendo Nyojo.
Oh, that's him. Yeah, that's Rujing.
Okay.
Yeah, I probably should have mentioned that
the
name.
names are different, right?
Yeah, you know how it's like they both have Chinese and Japanese names, and then that one's like the Japanese name. But yeah, he's also known as Tendo Nyojo. That's definitely Rujing. Yep.
Yeah, I loved the, and hope this isn't me putting my own translation on what you said, but, enlightenment is a functional relation, right? As opposed to something that, you grasp.
Yep.
I don't know if this was just me sort of reading into it. The sutra that we read today, there was a line that really stuck out to me in the Precious Jewel Mere Samadhi, in the one, when teachings and approaches are distinguished, each has a standard. Whether teachings and approaches are mastered or not, reality constantly flows.
Yeah.
So it's almost, it's something separate than something you can grab, or it constantly flows. It's more of like the nature of things,
Yep.
Could you read that again?
Yes. Let me find it. I just closed it. And this was from the Precious Jewel Mere Samadhi, which was the sutra that we did today. It was on the second page. So it says, when teachings and approaches are distinguished, each has its standard. Whether teachers and approaches are mastered or not, reality constantly flows.
Thank you.
That sounds a little bit like the doctrine of original enlightenment. No matter what you do, it's already there anyway. I guess that makes
Well,
sense.
Shinkyu, I really appreciated your talk. I want to say thank you. I'm going to have to sit with it and listen again.
Yeah.
A lot of history there that I didn't know, but it was very interesting. And then, yeah, his search for impermanence, that was, yeah, I hadn't heard that explained all the way, so that was...
Yeah. I've never actually heard it put that way, which is why I've been working on this thing for a long time, trying to figure out, like, they always talk about the process, and like they talk about them both separately, but not how how practice enlightenment and Zazen, quote unquote, like solved his issue of impermanence. So I don't know if anyone's talked about it like that or not. The whole time I was working on it, I didn't really have an answer myself either. And I was just hoping that by the time I got to the end of the talk, I'd be able to figure something out. And it would all fit together. And
I like it. I like it a lot. Something will come.
Yeah.
Well, how ironic would it be if we found a permanent answer to impermanence?
Yeah.
You kind of set it up like an action movie, knowing there will be a sequel.
Yes. Yeah, there's too much stuff. I'm like, I thought I'd be able to fit it all into one talk, but there's no way there's so much stuff I wanted to talk. I cut a lot of stuff out, too. But the second half of his life is just as interesting as the first half. There's a bunch of crazy stuff that happens, so I want to work on a talk about emptiness, like the history of that first, and I'm going to get back to the second half of Dogen's life and then talk about that.
I really like how you took the pre-Dogen Japanese community and explained it and how it went into Dogen.
Yep. That's another one I don't see too often. I was really interested in. Yep. There's even more stuff too that I didn't cover. There's the whole Tendai doctrine of the enlightenment of, or the Buddha nature of plants. He got that from Tendai. I talk about that in like the Rivers and Mountains Sutra. There's a couple other ones I can't remember. Yeah.
You have a question in the chat. You can read it and address it, Shinkyu.
Let me see if I can figure out where it's at.
Popped up in the bottom, right?
Long question.
Chat. Okay, here we go. If enlightenment is inherent and is manifested in sitting and conduct, what was the experience that Dogen Zenji? What was it? And why did it require verification by Ru Jing? Oh, what was his actual experience? He doesn't talk too much about what the experience was, but I would assume that it would have been him finally waking up to the present moment, like cutting through all the, what's the word? Not vexation's one thing they call it, but cutting through all that cutting through his, like, his mind was very analytical. I can tell by like reading the Shobo Genzo. It's like, whoa, he's got that type of mind where he can construct entire worlds and theories about everything very easily. If he's reading the Abhidharma Kosha at like 8, that's a different type of brain. I think what he finally did is like all the old koan stories where he realized there's the sound of the river. I've always been throwing a million things on top of that sound, spinning stories, spinning theories, telling myself, do I like that sound? Telling myself, do I not like that sound? Am I ignoring this? He just saw that he was right there. And
didn't that kind of happen when he was sitting zazen and the person next to him got chastised?
That's the one. Yep. I think that probably he might have been dozing himself a little bit, maybe. I don't. He doesn't say, but whatever it was, it's the old story where the Zen master just screams right in your face. You're like, ask him a very earnest philosophical question about these worlds you invented in your mind, and they just go and you're like, whoa, and then all of a sudden you're just in that the juxtaposition between that loud sound and the silence shocks you right into this present moment. I'm thinking that's something like what happened to Dogen. And if he would go, well, it's also polite to go to the master to ask about this experience. It's not just something, it's never just a me thing. It's a sangha, so it's multiple people, interpenetrating experience. He goes to Ru Jing as a matter of course. However, it would have been easy for him to have had some other experience maybe, and he's like, I bet that was my enlightenment experience. You need to have it verified by someone who also has had that experience to be sure that you haven't crafted some type of delusionary idea that I'm free from all of my thoughts. So that's the answer to Shomu's, my convoluted answer to Shomu's question.
I add to that.
Yeah.
I will also say, just because you have this enlightening experience and go to your master, your Zen master may not say at that point, yes, student, you are now enlightened.
Yeah.
Because sometimes nothing messes up a student more than to tell them that they got it.
Yeah. Oh, I want to
So
say.
you all may have that enlightening experience, and you may not just say, yeah.
To be fair, he made him stay another 2 years and like write poems and do all sorts of different things before he said officially, like, you've had this experience, but then there's more things you need to do in order to grow it, to ripen it. Yeah.
The first time I had that nothingness experience, I went and told Nona, and he goes, huh? Yeah, go back and sit.
Yeah.
Best thing to say something like that.
Yeah.
Yes, said Shin.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think two things. I think the whole question of, what was the experience where Dogen became enlightened, it's much of that sudden Renzai sort of Zen kind of a question when, the whole, the string of Soto Zen it's a very gradual thing. I think there's lots of hints along this journey of him finding little bits. I mean, it's like asking a piano player, during what scale that you were practicing did you become a piano player? Well, and I think in the same sort of vein, I think if someone were to ask me, are you enlightened? I think the only real answer would be sometimes.
Yeah.
I think one of my favorite parts of the Dogen story that you I think talk about this too at the Grand Temple, but you really see how the old Japanese Buddhism before he had his journey affected him in his interactions with the cook, because for him, Buddhism was the vehicle of of achieving merit and of status, and it was a tool used by the ruling class to bring sort of prestige to or honor or worship to the ruling class. And when he saw the cook who was giving up these things that were seen as like the high positions and the more I guess in his mind the more valuable positions, and to just completely be putting all that aside to just do the work that was given to him that day. I think you could also say that was a big point for Dogen as well. I mean, the fact that he wrote about it so much, I think, is also a testament to that, because I don't know, it's such a stark difference between the Zen that he was seeing in China versus the Buddhism that he was seeing in Japan, I think. And I love the stories that kind of show how foolish he might have been, or how long they needed to go in that moment.
Yeah. To be fair, he didn't write his own enlightenment story. That I didn't write about it because I think it's something that happened, and after he died, his students, they needed to get verification bureaucratically for his enlightenment, so that they could be considered an established school. So they went back, they took another journey to Tiantong Monastery and spoke with whoever was the abbot there at the time, they must have kept records. They did keep records of everyone's enlightenment stories, and they got that story from the monastery. Dogen never wrote it himself. He, of course, he wrote about all the gradual stuff, like the Tenzo Kyokun stuff with the old cooks, but he didn't write his own story down. So you don't hear, there's a bit of controversy in some Soto circles about his enlightenment, whether it really happened or not. And
maybe he wasn't enlightened. We're all fools.
We bought into it. No.
And I would say 100% Dogen would agree with that if you said maybe he wasn't enlightened. Bingo. Yeah. My thought of Dogen. Because, there's a lot of Zen Buddhas that if you meet anybody that says they're enlightened, you need to look askew and say, I don't know about that.
Wasn't there a book like that? If you meet the Buddha on the road, kill him?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's old koan. Really old koan.
This is a mystery to me. You did a fabulous job of portraying all of the elevated aspects of life that he was searching with, all the tools. So he had wealth, he had intelligence, he had a large prominent family, he had all the advantages in life, which, according to the story, he kind of had to realize that at a certain point were impediments.
Yeah.
Now, were all these esteemed teachers, had they also been enlightened in the same way? And then if they were, how did they stay in their previous lives that they were in when Dogen was reaching out to them. Am I making myself clear? So if I'm a wealthy merchant or an esteemed person in a royal house, I am considered to be an enlightened one, how can I be both of those things at the same time? Because I would have realized in my enlightenment, as Dogen did, that those, quote, blessings were actually impediments. I'm not sure I'm saying
I know
what
it.
I want.
I got you.
Okay.
There's a lot of it goes back. I can't say every single Zen master, but a lot of them treated it like a career. It was something that you moved up. There was even controversies. I don't know if this was as early as this time or not, but people that would purchase enlightenment certificates, because everyone in China, I can't remember the time period, would have certificates.
Still get those?
I don't know if they still have those, but they had them for a while, and you can they're still around in museums and stuff. You can see Inca. They still have the name in Rinzai, like Inca Shomei, which is can't speak for Rinzai. I might be talking about something completely different, but it's the verification and the document you get that tells you that you've had the enlightenment experience and now you were able to teach. Back in the day, you could purchase those types of things, or you could just get them as a matter of course, or all sorts of things. So that's kind of what Dogen was alluding to when he's saying everybody he ran into just couldn't answer his questions. However, he did find Ru Jing, who in his estimation was the real deal. So there's a whole, I can't think of noble family to Buddhism pipeline where you just kind of moved from one into the other. I'm sure there were people that also were from dirt poor families that made their way up as well, but most of them were from kind of well-to-do noble families.
I think too, I don't know if this is exactly what was your question, but I think maybe in Dogen's particular story, these things were impediments to him answering his question. But just because they function as an impediment for Dogen didn't necessarily also mean that they, the nature of these things are to impede. I mean, I'm sure there may have been a teacher in Japan before Dogen who was able to sort of answer all the questions for themselves with the tools given them.
In spite of their advantages.
Sure.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I hear you.
Yeah. I think Shomu had a question too, so if anyone wants to say
Yeah,
something.
he wanted to follow up.
Okay. Let me do that real quick. So I guess my question is that if it's a touch and go matter, then of what necessity is an enlightenment experience, and wouldn't this make Soto a gradual school? It's neither. I would say it's neither. It's not really both, and at least the way that it's conceptualized, it's that you're always already there. And that's not even a Soto thing. If you read some of these old sutras, your enlightenment, you are enlightenment, and it's like the vexations that are put on top of it, and all the delusion and our ideas about what things are that obscures that. And Soto, it's when you're sitting in Zazen, you drop these thoughts away, and you just are in that present moment. You just manifest as nothing but this present moment. An enlightenment experience? Like I said, let me see what he said exactly. Is important? What's the necessity? Depends on probably who you're asking. It's nice. It's like working really hard at work and suddenly your boss tells you you're doing a good job. You don't really need you don't need that to know that you're doing a good job, but it's kind of nice to have someone recognize it. You're well, I've been doing a good job this whole time and no one said anything, and maybe I'll just keep going about my way. But it lets you know that what's going on has been really going on. I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think it also offers some, like you said, like clarity, like, I don't know if this is, just my own experiences, but whenever I had, sparks of, clarity, it's not just, oh, I just have that. It's, oh, this is a familiar thing. This is something that's always been around.
Yeah.
It's almost little windows into, oh, this is how things always are.
Yeah.
Like, you could take your example when your boss is saying you did a good job. It's not that you weren't doing a good job before. It's that, oh, I do a good job, and I've done a good job for a while, right? And so I think it's more of it's not like in the moment, it's a sort of eliminating that, oh, this is how things are. This is the nature of enlightenment too. And I think another way to think about enlightenment is to replace enlightenment with another thing, like, say, compassion, right? I mean, so you could say, is it necessary to have a compassion experience to be a compassionate person? Compassion isn't something that you've achieved. It's something that you actively, practice and that you show. And that's a function between you and the people around you in a way too. And, you don't just say, okay, I've achieved being compassionate, so now I no longer have to be compassionate to practice anymore. It's this thing that, is constantly sort of being enacted, and, it doesn't really go away when you, or come when you do something compassionate. Compassion doesn't arrive, and when you stop being compassionate, it's not gone. It's just sort of more of a functional relation between you and your practice and the people around you.
Yeah.
We had a foundational sutra at the temple. We've changed it to the Heart Sutra, but it was the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is dang near 2,000 pages. But everybody that got ordained had to do one assignment from there, at least one, and it was the story of Sadhana. And I forget exactly what his question was, but he goes to the Buddha and basically says, how do I get enlightened? And the Buddha sends him off to another monk, another master. And he asks the same question, and the master basically says, you're already there, buddy. But he still asks the question, so he goes to somebody else and somebody else and somebody else and keeps asking the question. And finally somebody says the right thing. He goes, oh, I'm already here.
Yep.
So, but it took 200 pages to get there.
All right, let me see. Shomu is back again. Let me see. Let me see. Yes, my understanding is that the experience is a glimpse into what is ever present and all-pervading, but that to me makes me wonder why we need that glimpse if we just live carrying out the precepts to the best of our ability. And then the second one, my understanding of enlightenment in most schools is that it is actually considered when real practice begins. Rinzai for sure, but I've seen it in other places. The Rinzai does say that you need your first break into enlightenment. The Buddha too, with his four stages of enlightenment, that's another, they have that same conception too, that once you see the emptiness of self, then you're now a stream enterer. Before that, you're just practicing towards that. Let me see what makes me why. Oh, do we really need it? I think that if you practice long enough, you're going to see it anyway, and it's just a step along the path. Is anything necessary?
Well, how can you need something that doesn't go away and is always there, and it's just the nature of something?
Yeah. I like to say, it's like we practice to realize that we're alive. It's like you can't become more alive than you already are. But is it necessary to realize that you are alive in order for this to go? Dogen's answer would be that the second you sit down and start using the precepts, so like having that be part of your life, then you are actualizing your enlightenment. Because like that behavior, the behavior of the precepts is enlightened behavior. Like giving dana to people, giving your time to people, accepting dana from other people, or meditating, actually sitting down and like working with it. All the paramitas, those things too, all that, it's all enlightened behavior. Do you need to realize that it's enlightened behavior for it to be enlightened behavior? No. It's nice. Like we said, it's nice to realize it. But if you practice it long enough, you will. The point is that you've got to. It's the concepts and the ideas that you build up around it. Like, it is important to get through those to kind of see just the bare bones of what it is you're doing, that you're just alive here, luminous, existing. Do you need that to say that you're a Buddhist? No, I don't think so, but like, what about the time, like, that's the main question. That's like, what's the meaning of life? It's like that type of question.
I think too, like, from your stories too, being careful that we're not framing it in the sort of old Dogen way, the pre-Dogen way of enlightenment as a status symbol,
Yeah.
that you pin onto your quote saying, I'm enlightened, so you have to listen to me, kind of thing. You achieve something you haven't, too. Versus enlightenment as, the chef sticking to his duty.
And also,
I apologize, folks. I've got company that's hammering at my door, so I've got to go. I really appreciate it.
very nice to see you.
It's good to see you.
Thank
See you soon.
See you again.
And also, there's, I think, something about expectations. I mean, what do we think enlightenment is, and what is real enlightenment? And there's a book, I've never read the book, but I love the title, First Enlightenment, Then the Laundry.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And if you read through the Den Kuroko, all these enlightenment experiences are so boring. You look at a flower, somebody calls your name, somebody tugs on your kesa, you hear a pebble on bamboo. They're really boring, everyday experiences, but you're there.
Yeah.
And the only common thread through anybody's enlightenment experience is they're there at the moment. The Tenzo, he was there buying mushrooms.
Yeah, there's I forgot what I was gonna say. Sorry.
New Sangha member.
Yeah.
We live real close to Fort Riley, and they've been sending an awful lot of people to Poland, and for the last year, and they've been practicing on some really big bombs. And poor Layla, you can just hear it booming, and the house shakes. Poor Layla is so afraid, so she's been here shaking the whole time.
Oh.
So there was a big boom a few minutes ago, and she's just over here right next to me to say, make it stop. And it's like, I wish I could stop all bombing in the world, but I can't.
Yeah.
So as soon as we're done here, I'm going to go give her a tranquilizer.
Oh.
Treat the symptoms, since I can't treat the problem.
Well, there's one thing.
But
oh, go ahead.
You had a question, Marion, before I got
Well,
on?
I'm just reflecting on, what is an enlightenment moment? And thinking about in my own life what I would have called an enlightenment moment. And I think the only thing I could characterize with is as we've all been saying, it's that you saw something differently in some way. For me, it also involved a level of transformation in my perception about the world. First of all, that such a moment could ever exist. I mean, when you see something in a new way that you never knew could exist, it's transformative because in the moment you realize, well, I've been going around forever not seeing that, and yet there it was, a single orange on a tree. We've had those kinds of just totally sparkling special moments that we'll never forget. So I guess the transformative element is that you recognize that you saw something in a new way and that is possible. So then the next problem comes when you start going out trying to find it again. then you have to realize that's not going to happen. That's not how this is going to work. So then again, you're back sitting and waiting for the next sparkling moment.
Yeah.
But realizing you probably won't be able to make it happen. It will just happen.
It's kind of like comparing it to compassion or comparing it to your boss coming saying, good job. You know, if you want every day a good job from your boss, it's not going to happen.
Yeah.
And if it does happen every day, it'll cease to be special.
That's true.
And sometimes you're compassionate and sometimes you're not. And you can't go looking for the right time to be compassionate. I need to go find a way to be compassionate today. But yet you don't take time to pet your cat when she comes up to you because you're so busy hunting for the time to be compassionate.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like,
Gotta go.
the one.
Thinking that masterful amount of information you gave us, I could listen to that a couple more times because I would be looking for. I mean, I was finding threads. I was characterizing things. I was categorizing things, and there's just a lot there. You assimilated it and spoke it rather amazingly well from my perspective. Not that you stand to be judged, but I just appreciate your clarity and your you just have a way of teaching that is uncluttered, and I appreciate that.
Mm. Thank you. Wait. Oh. Shum was still. See what he's got. Let me read this out. To be clear, I don't think enlightenment is something I need to get to be a good Buddhist or that it is the end of the road. On the contrary, it would be a new beginning. My view is that the best way is constantly returning to the precepts and sitting again and again, not seeking for anything special other than benefiting all beings. I'm just confused on the doctrine as all. Oh, like that's the... I think I've told you before, like this doctrine is like a koan. They say that Soto doesn't have a koan. The koan is figuring out what you're figuring out right now, and you are working on that koan. So in a sense, like you're doing the work right now. The work is the path, as they say, and that's the one that, I mean, still to this day, I'll sit in Zazen and I'll just, you're supposed to not be doing anything. I'll just realize that I'm trying to, while sitting in Zazen, I realize I'm trying to sit in Zazen. I'm trying to figure out how to sit in Zazen, which is insane. I'm sitting in Zazen. Why am I trying to figure out, like, something in the back of my brain is always going, I've got to find this one thing so I can just sit perfectly. And part of it is realizing that you're doing that nonsense, and then you can just and actually sit, and then just keep doing that. Keep doing that, keep doing that. And like that quietness, when you finally are just sitting, that's the inherent enlightenment manifesting. Now, it might not be like getting punched in the face, a level of experience, but that punched in the face level of experience that we're talking about is it's a contrast. It's like those stories where you ask this philosophical question and the Zen master screams it in your face. It's a contrast between those things. But there's quiet enlightenment too, where you're just walking and just feeling your feet on the ground, or you're walking and you hear the cars in the distance, and then you are just the cars in the distance. Quiet enlightenment experience. Now we're looking. We hear the stories of the loud getting smacked in the face enlightenment experiences, but the quiet ones are the ones where you've probably even seen those in your own practice, where you sit and now suddenly you hear, I don't know, somebody come into the house, but you really hear them come into the house, like you hear the keys jingling, those type of things. I think that's kind of what Dogen's talking about when he's saying practice is enlightenment. It's always enlightenment. Sometimes it's just really quiet and soft enlightenment, and there's no fireworks exploding. Yeah, Sonshin.
I wanted to read this little blurb from the middle of the Mahaprajnaparamita
Mm.
Sutra. So, no path, no knowledge, and no attainment. With nothing to attain, Bodhisattva relies on Prajnaparamita, and thus the mind is without hindrance. And I think too, like I'm remembering back to, my original sort of interest into what a bodhisattva thought was, or what it really means. The most basic understanding of a bodhisattva is you're going to withhold your own enlightenment, so that everybody else can, until everybody can achieve that enlightenment. But also, I think it's an acknowledgement that, the absurdity of sitting with a cause or with a goal to be enlightened or to get enlightenment is sort of self-defeating in a way. And I think even that little line in there, or that original understanding of the bodhisattva vows, it sort of like gets us off the hook a little bit. Like, finally I can sit because there's no high stakes, and so that's all the way. I don't have to worry about grades. I don't have to worry about, meeting a quota. I can just finally sit in peace now.
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about all the enlightenment stuff, and I can just finally sit in peace and be here.
Yep. Yeah. I'll bring that to what Shoma was just talking about. He was talking about how he was sitting at the hospital and he saw the snow falling. So like he really saw the snow falling. That's, you call it an enlightenment experience, like what you're saying. About like the bodhisattva, like being off the hook, like, or seeking an enlightenment experience. Like like you said, the trick is always that it's always there. Like when you're sitting there and you see the snowfall, like I was saying, it's like a quiet enlightenment experience. Now, if you had been had the most hectic day of your, like the ones that people talk about, like one of my friends, one of the guys from, it was Brett, who used to talk about that, how and I had the exact same experience too, where I had this breakup and I was just like feeling terrible, like the worst in the whole I've ever felt in my life, and then just digging down, horrible, and all of a sudden you realize, boop, I'm right here. Oh, it's that juxtaposition of like insane stress to like, oh, all of a sudden I'm here, that makes the great story. But when you're just like, I don't know, you woke up and you had a cup of coffee and you're like scratching your head and all of a sudden you're like, boop, my coffee cup's here. That doesn't seem like this great revelation, but it's like, bomb. That's the exact same experience. It's just contextualized differently. And like with the, like, oh, go ahead.
I think I've been sort of, I don't know what the word is, maybe unfair expectations that always been thrown on me from my being raised in the Southern Baptist Church. And, every week you'd have somebody come up and give their, big, flashy redemption story of, how, I was a sinner and I did all these things and I found God and my entire life has changed around. Whoever had the biggest flashes, whoever had change, got the most, applause. And sometimes I think enlightenment can be like that, but sometimes it's not, like you said, and it doesn't need to be. Yeah, like,
what did you do bad this week? I took somebody's pencil and I didn't bring it back. I realized that it was bad. You're like, okay, like whatever. That's not a great story, but you're like, I stole $1 million from these orphans, and then I gave it to charity. I gave it back to them because I realized it was wrong. Now that's the story you want to hear about. That's the one that we've written down and told over and over again. But the little pencil story, it's not memorable. But that's life. I've got a whole stack. I need to bring these back. I've got stacks of pens from work that I have here. I need to bring back. That's my enlightenment. I'm looking at them right now. Boom. Like, oh man, that's right. I need to be a bodhisattva today and bring those pens back. And I do use them. I'm not just hoarding them here, but other people could use them. So I'm going to bring them back. But yeah. Do you have anything else, Shomo?
I'm glad the enlightenment stories are boring sometimes. Because
there was one about a guy, I can't remember, it was a Rinzai guy that he never wanted to tell a story because his story was he was awakened while he was taking a pee, and the water was like he was hearing the water splashing, and he like woke up. Then he's like, ugh. Oh yeah, is that Omori Sogen? Yeah, that's the one. That's like there's the old koan. It's like where's the gate to enlightenment? Where can I enter it? Like, you hear that river, enter there. Well, for him, you hear that bathroom or that toilet, enter there. Wherever. It's just like that's just normal life. Sometimes you wake up there. Yeah.
I'm sitting here thinking about a time that I literally employed. I employed an enlightenment moment. I don't know if this is totally off topic, but so, I carried away from a given sashina a moment out in the desert, one of those lovely moments that we all are talking about. Then, later on, in the middle of COVID, when we were in Arizona, completely in absolute lockdown, and our house that we were in was 4 miles from a raging forest fire that caused so much smoke that we had to have all of our windows sealed up with wet towels. And between the lockdown and that, I was beginning to feel very, very anxious and claustrophobic, and like feeling like maybe I wasn't going to be able to hang on here. And I don't know how it came to me. I didn't intend this, but I remembered a time in one of Natalie Goldberg's books about a big breakup, and she ended up out in the front yard with horror tales and terror rolling around her mind about what was going to happen. And then she reaches out and, touches the grass and touches the suitcase that's sitting next to her. So I did that. I reached out on my bed and I touched the sheet and I said, I'm here in a bed on a sheet. And I took the story of horror out of my mind and brought it to that very moment of just being there. So that's the closest I can ever describe of having used or employed an enlightenment experience in my life. Otherwise, I think we're all, maybe I don't think we can quantify it much. I think it just is, and I think it'll just come into our lives at random moments that we probably can't control. But that was one that I'm so grateful for, because I think it saved my sanity.
We are in the period of Rahatsu now. The 7 days where Buddha sat down and said, I'm going to sit here until I understand the meaning of birth and death. And I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but for 7 days he sits there, and finally he touches the ground.
Yep.
Myra is harassing him. He touches the ground and he says, I have the right to know. The ground touching mudra. And that is a moment that Buddha became enlightened. So the ground touching, the ground touching mudra is I have the right to be here, and I have the right to be peaceful about it. So that's very common. The earth touching is very common.
I don't even know about that. I don't know about a mudra. So you're talking about a physical movement that you do.
Like one hand up, one hand on the ground, right, Suji?
Yeah.
Yep. Or this is a mudra. This is a cosmic mudra that we do in Zazen.
Teaching mudra, giving mudra.
Like the turning of the dharma wheel.
Yep.
Yes. There are thousands of mudras. Google them. But next Friday, after we sit, I will talk about Rahatsu and Buddha's enlightenment, because we should be starting our 7-day session yesterday, and I'm not.
It's not too late.
I'm not feeling well enough. I was supposed to go to Nebraska Zen Center and sit for 4 days, teach, and I said I can't do it. But anyway, ground touching mudra very common, very popular, I was taught that because I had great anger, and it's hard to sit with anger, and Kyoki said, touch the ground and let the anger go into the ground. And it was like, touch the ground and zazen, it was like, whoosh.
Wow.
It's a very powerful mudra. I'm glad you did it, because you saw how powerful it is.
Yeah.
Yes, I had no idea what I was doing. It just came to me from a memory of what I had read from Natalie Goldberg, because I could relate to that moment, in that moment. So now I need to go learn about mudras.
It's a rabbit hole that you can go down for days.
Yep.
And I think what you said was really special too, because it kind of gives us another way to look at these enlightenment stories. You know,
Yes.
they're not just, you know, how these people got something that we're trying to look for. It's how can I learn from their stories? You know, what can I take and apply to my life? I mean, even something as simple as somebody was peeing and they got it.
Yep.
I think the lesson even that is there's not a single thing that we do, not a single movement that couldn't bring, you know, tremendous like illumination to our lives. And so no matter what we're doing, if we're peeing or cutting a carrot or driving in our car, like there's something that can make that moment really impactful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think I see that.
So everybody, when you pee today.
Every day.
Attention.
Well, I'm gonna have to head out soon. I don't know if you want to keep talking or if you would like.
You know, I think it's about time. Okay, Shamu said something.
Oh, he said Buddha said touch grass.
We can always talk more next week.
Oh yeah.
Beings are numberless. I vow to free them. Delusions are inexhaustible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless. I vow to enter them. Buddha's ways unsurpassable. I vow to realize it.
Thank you, everyone. It was a beautiful discussion and a lovely talk. I got a lot out of it, Shinkyu.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
We'll see y'all soon.